They thought they were just getting high. Turns out they were erasing themselves. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most terrifying drug story unfolding in America right now. And it's not fentanyl. Fentanyl kills fast. It's brutal, it's efficient, and it makes the news. But there's something happening in rural America in 2026 that's quieter, slower, and in many ways far more horrifying. Because it doesn't kill the body first. It kills the mind. It hollows a person out from the inside while they're still walking around, still breathing, still technically alive. Scientists started calling it a psychosis epidemic. Emergency room doctors in West Virginia started calling it something else entirely. They called it a wave we have no idea how to stop. The drug is P2P methamphetamine, and before you assume you know this story, you don't. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Now, the old meth, the kind Walter White cooked, the kind your high school DARE officer warned you about with laminated photo cards, that stuff was bad. It rotted teeth, destroyed families, lit up trailer parks like Christmas trees, but it had a ceiling. Use it long enough, get clean, and your brain had a fighting chance. Damaged, sure. Scarred, absolutely. But there was something left to work with. P2P meth has no such courtesy. P2P stands for phenyl 2-propanone, a precursor chemical that Mexican cartels switched to in the early 2000s when US law enforcement cracked down on ephedrine, the original building block of methamphetamine. The cartels adapted. They always do. And what they produced was chemically different in ways that took researchers almost a decade to fully understand. It looked like meth. It smelled like meth. It got people high like meth. But what it did to the brain over time was something no one had quite seen before. Something that, by 2026, was showing up in rural American communities with the consistency and devastation of a natural disaster, except slower, and with no FEMA response team waiting at the county line. This is the story of one man caught inside that disaster. His name is Travis Cole, 34 years old, McDowell County, West Virginia, which, if you've never heard of it, is one of the most economically devastated counties in the entire United States. At its peak in the 1950s, McDowell County had over 100,000 residents and some of the most productive coal mines in the country. By 2026, the population had collapsed to under 17,000. The mines were gone. The jobs were gone. The young people who could leave had left, and the ones who stayed did so because they had nowhere else to go, no money to get there, or roots too deep to pull up without tearing something vital. Travis had roots. He was born in the county, raised in a town called Welch, which sounds charming and is not. He went to the local high school, where the football team was the one thing that still generated genuine community pride. He wasn't a star player, but he was reliable, which turned out to be the single trait that defined his early adult life. Reliable. He showed up. He did the work. After graduation, he didn't go to college. There was no money for that and no particular culture pushing him toward it. But he found something better, or so it seemed at the time. He found a trade. Travis became a mechanic. For most of his 20s, it worked. He rented a small house, drove a truck that was always one repair away from disaster, but somehow kept running, and worked at a shop called Dunbar's Auto on the main road into Welch. He was good at it. Genuinely good. The kind of mechanic who could listen to an engine and diagnose the problem before opening the hood. He got married at 26 to a woman named Kelsey. They had a daughter, Emma, born when Travis was 28. For approximately 3 years, the life was small but functional. Tight money, sure. Arguments about bills, yes, but functional. Then Dunbar's closed. The owner retired. His son had no interest in the business. No one else in the county had the capital to buy it. The shop sat empty for 8 months, then became a storage unit rental, then burned down in a fire that the fire marshal ruled accidental and that everyone in town suspected was insurance. Travis lost his job, spent 4 months looking for comparable work within driving distance, found nothing, and started doing side work out of his driveway, which paid inconsistently and not enough. Kelsey left in 2023. Not dramatically, not with screaming or lawyers or a dramatic scene. She simply reached the point where she couldn't watch the slow slide anymore and made the rational decision to take Emma and move to her sister's place in Charleston. Travis didn't fight it. He told himself he'd get back on his feet and then fight for more custody time. He believed this. That's the part worth noting. He genuinely believed it. By 2024, the county had 3 things in abundance: poverty, despair, and methamphetamine. The opioid wave had already crashed through McDowell County in the 2000s with catastrophic results. Hundreds of overdose deaths, entire extended families hollowed out. The social infrastructure, the churches, the community centres, the informal networks of neighbours who looked after neighbours, had been badly damaged by a decade of OxyContin and heroin and fentanyl moving through the county like a slow flood. When that wave receded, it left behind a landscape that was chemically, socially, and economically primed for the next thing. The next thing was P2P Meth. It arrived cheaply and in quantity. By the time Travis started using, a single dose cost between $2 and $4, less than a coffee, less than a gas station sandwich. The people selling it weren't shadowy figures from another world. They were neighbours, cousins, guys Travis had gone to school with who had found the one growth industry left in the county. The supply chain ran from Mexican cartel operations through distribution networks in nearby cities, and then directly into rural communities through channels so well established by 2024 that buying meth in McDowell County was, logistically speaking, easier than buying fresh vegetables. Travis started using in the spring of 2024. He was 31 years old. He wasn't naive about what he was doing. He knew what meth was, knew what it did, had watched it destroy people he'd grown up with. But knowing a thing and being immune to it are different categories entirely. He was isolated, broke, sleeping in a house that felt enormous now that his daughter wasn't in it, and someone offered him something that made all of that temporarily, chemically, convincingly feel manageable. He said yes. For the first few months, the drug delivered on its promises with alarming reliability. He had energy. He worked more. He felt for the first time in years like someone who had a grip on things. This is the cruelest part of the early phase. Meth doesn't feel like destruction in the beginning. It feels like correction, like finally running at the speed you were always supposed to run at. He kept using. Weeks became months. The dose that worked in April wasn't enough by July. The gap between highs and lows widened into a canyon. By the fall of 2024, he was using daily. By the winter, the character of the drug was changing, or rather, the character of what it was doing to him was changing. The energy was becoming something else, sharper, edgier, less like fuel and more like pressure. He started sleeping less, not as a choice but as a fact. 3 hours, 2 hours. Sometimes not at all for days at a stretch, which the brain handles the way an engine handles running without oil. It keeps going right up until the moment it doesn't. By the spring of 2025, Travis Cole had been using P2P methamphetamine for approximately 12 months. He was 32 years old, 25 pounds underweight, and increasingly difficult to recognize, not just physically, but behaviorally, for anyone who had known him before. His mother, who lived 20 minutes away and had been checking on him weekly, began to notice things she couldn't quite name. Small things. The way he'd stop mid-conversation and look at something she couldn't see. The way certain questions seemed to confuse him in a way that went beyond distraction. She told herself he was just stressed. Then, one afternoon in May 2025, something happened that she didn't tell herself anything about, because she didn't know about it. Travis was in a Walmart parking lot in Bluefield, sitting in his truck after buying motor oil and a sandwich when he stopped being in the parking lot. Not physically. He was still there, still sitting in the driver's seat, motor running. But something in his mind detached from the agreed-upon version of reality and drifted somewhere else entirely. He got out of the truck. He walked to the entrance of the store, and then he stopped. He stood there for 11 minutes. People walked around him. A store employee came to the door and looked at him. Travis didn't move. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't mumbling, wasn't doing anything that would definitively read as a crisis. He was simply standing perfectly still, staring at the automatic doors, absolutely convinced, with the full weight of felt certainty, that they were breathing, slowly, in and out, like lungs. He watched them breathe for 11 minutes. Then something shifted. The world snapped back, and he got in his truck and drove home. He didn't tell anyone. He wasn't sure afterward that it had really happened. Maybe he'd just zoned out. Maybe he was tired. He was tired. But that's not what it was. To understand what was happening to Travis Cole in that Walmart parking lot, you need to understand something that most people, including most doctors in rural America, didn't fully grasp until it was already everywhere. P2P meth is not the same drug as the methamphetamine that defined the 1990s and 2000s. Chemically related, yes. Functionally, it's something different enough that treating them as the same substance is like treating a kitchen fire and a chemical plant explosion as the same category of problem, because both involve flames. The original methamphetamine, the kind made from ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, the cold medicine precursor, was what chemists call a predominantly D-methamphetamine compound. It hit the brain's dopamine system like a sledgehammer. Dopamine flooded the reward pathways. The user felt euphoric, powerful, invincible. The crash was brutal. The addiction was severe. But the mechanism was, in a terrible way, straightforward. Dopamine up, crash, repeat, destroy. P2P methamphetamine produces a racemic mixture, meaning it contains both D-methamphetamine and L-methamphetamine in roughly equal parts. That L-isomer is the element that changes everything. It has a much stronger effect on the brain serotonin and norepinephrine systems simultaneously, which means P2P meth doesn't just flood the reward system. It floods multiple systems at once, in a ratio and combination that the human brain was never designed to process. The result isn't just a more intense high. The result is a fundamentally different category of neurological event. Researchers who began publishing findings on P2P meth in 2022 and 2023 described something that alarmed them immediately, not because it was theoretically dangerous, but because it was practically indistinguishable on a clinical level from paranoid schizophrenia, not similar to it, not reminiscent of it, indistinguishable from it, down to the specific delusional structures, the auditory hallucinations, the pattern of onset and escalation. This created an immediate and serious problem. When someone arrives in a rural emergency room in West Virginia exhibiting paranoid delusions, hearing voices, and showing signs of complete disconnection from consensus reality, the clinical team has to make a rapid determination. Is this a psychiatric emergency, or is this drug toxicity? The treatment protocols are different. The medications are different. The prognosis is radically different. Getting it wrong doesn't just inconvenience the patient, it can actively make things worse. By 2025, emergency physicians in states like West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee were reporting that the sheer volume of P2P psychosis cases was overwhelming their capacity to properly evaluate each one. One ER doctor in Charleston described the situation in a medical journal as diagnosing in the dark with a flashlight that keeps flickering. That quote was published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was not hyperbole. But here's where the story takes a turn that even the researchers didn't initially see coming. Traditional meth psychosis, the kind produced by ephedrine-based methamphetamine, was horrible, but had a relatively predictable trajectory. A user in psychosis who was detoxed, stabilized, and given time would, in most cases, see the psychosis diminish significantly. The brain, given the chance, could partially repair the damage. Not fully, not always. But the psychosis itself was largely reactive, meaning it was a response to the drug being present, and it receded, at least partially, when the drug left. P2, P-meth psychosis behaved differently. By 2024, clinicians across multiple states were documenting a pattern that had no good precedent in the addiction medicine literature. Patients who had been clean for weeks, sometimes months, were still psychotic, not mildly symptomatic. Actively, severely psychotic. Patients who had been stabilized in inpatient settings, discharged, and remained abstinent were returning weeks later in full psychotic breaks, drug-free but completely disconnected from reality. The researchers had a technical term for what they were observing. They called it persistent stimulant-induced psychosis with post-abstinence continuation. The doctors in the emergency rooms called it something shorter and far more despairing. They called it permanent, not for every patient, not inevitably, not unavoidably. But for a significant and growing subset of chronic P2P meth users, the psychosis was no longer a symptom of active drug use. It had become a feature of a brain that had been structurally altered beyond the point where abstinence alone could undo the damage. The drug had essentially reprogrammed the neurological hardware, and the new programming ran whether or not the drug was present. This is what Travis Cole was walking into, without knowing it, without anyone telling him, in a county where the nearest addiction specialist was 90 miles away and had a waiting list measured in months. The mechanism behind this permanence took researchers several years to piece together, and the explanation, while technical, is worth understanding, because it reframes everything about how we think of P2P meth addiction as a moral or behavioral failure. Methamphetamine in general causes the brain to release enormous quantities of dopamine, far more than any natural stimulus like food, sex, or social connection could ever produce. This is well established. What's less well known is what happens to the dopamine-producing infrastructure during prolonged exposure. The brain, an organ that prioritizes efficiency above nearly everything else, responds to the constant dopamine flood by downregulating its own production machinery. It destroys dopamine receptors. It reduces the number of dopamine transporters. It essentially dismantles the factory because the factory seems unnecessary when supply is being delivered in truckloads from outside. When the drug stops, the factory is gone. The user is left in a state where the brain is physically, structurally incapable of producing anything close to normal dopamine levels on its own. Everything feels flat, grey, and meaningless. Food tastes like nothing. Sleep provides no rest. Human connection generates no warmth. The only thing that produces anything resembling sensation is the drug, because the drug bypasses the broken factory and delivers directly. P2, P-meth does all of this, and then it adds the serotonin disruption on top. Serotonin is the system that regulates mood stability, perception of reality, and the brain's ability to distinguish between internal experience and external reality. When P2P meth hammers this system repeatedly over months, something begins to break down in the filtering mechanism, the neurological process that separates this is real from this is a product of my own mind. For Travis, the breathing doors at Walmart weren't a hallucination in the casual sense. They were, to every functional part of his brain's reality processing system, as real as the pavement under his feet. That's not a metaphor. That's neuroscience. By the summer of 2025, Travis was using daily, sleeping between 2 and 4 hours per night, and losing weight at a rate that his mother would later describe as watching someone disappear in real time. But the physical deterioration, as alarming as it was, wasn't the most disturbing development. The most disturbing development was the pattern of his thinking. P2P psychosis doesn't typically arrive as a sudden break, a dramatic moment where the person goes from functional to delusional in a single step. It builds. It assembles itself gradually from ordinary human tendencies, suspicion, pattern recognition, the instinct to find meaning in coincidence, and amplifies them past the point of reason by degrees so incremental that neither the person experiencing it nor the people around them can identify exactly when normal anxiety became something else entirely. Travis started with small suspicions, reasonable ones even. He felt like his neighbour, a man in his 60s named Gerald, who had never given Travis any particular reason for concern, was watching his driveway. He started parking his truck differently to reduce visibility from Gerald's windows. That's not psychosis. That's just mild, unfounded paranoia, the kind most people experience occasionally without consequence. But the drug kept working. Within weeks, the suspicion about Gerald had grown an architecture. Gerald wasn't just watching, he was reporting. To whom, Travis couldn't be certain, but the conviction that someone was being informed about his movements was absolute and unshakable. He started varying his schedule. He stopped answering his door. He covered the windows on the side of the house facing Gerald's property with black garbage bags, which he taped from the inside with the methodical care of someone performing an entirely rational task. His mother saw the garbage bags on a visit in late July. She asked about them. Travis gave an explanation that was internally coherent, logical sounding, structured, following the rules of cause and effect, but built entirely on premises that had no relationship to reality. She stood in his living room and listened to her son explain something that made complete sense within its own framework and zero sense outside of it. She drove home. She told herself he was just stressed. She was scared. But scared of what exactly she couldn't say, because what was happening to her son didn't have a name she recognized yet, and naming a thing is often the first step toward being able to do something about it. Without the name, she just drove home and waited, the way people wait when they can see something coming and have no idea how to stand in front of it. Travis, meanwhile, went back inside his house, checked that the garbage bags were still secure and sat down in the kitchen. There was a sound, low, faint, below the threshold of what most people would consciously register. An electrical hum from the refrigerator probably, or the HVAC system, or just the ambient noise that every house makes when you're sitting still in it at night. Travis heard it differently. He sat in the kitchen for 3 hours, perfectly still, listening to the hum, certain, with the same complete, unquestionable certainty with which he'd once known that a knocking engine sound meant a failing bearing, that the sound was meant for him specifically, that it was trying to tell him something, that he just needed to listen more carefully. Here's something that doesn't make the news often enough. The single most important factor determining whether a person survives addiction isn't willpower, family support, or even the severity of the addiction itself. It's geography. Where you live when the crisis hits determines almost everything that follows. It determines how fast you get help, what kind of help you get, whether anyone with actual expertise ever evaluates you, and whether the window between still savable and too late stays open long enough for the system to reach you. In a city, that window can be navigated. Resources exist, even if imperfect. Treatment centers, psychiatric facilities, addiction specialists, harm reduction programs. The infrastructure is there, flawed and underfunded but present. In McDowell County, West Virginia, in 2025, the window was open. The problem was that everything capable of climbing through it was 90 miles away. The nearest certified addiction treatment facility to Travis's home required a 94-mile drive on roads that were, depending on the season, either difficult or genuinely dangerous. That facility had 28 beds. It served a 5-county area with a combined population of roughly 80,000 people. Its waiting list as of mid-2025 averaged between 5 and 7 weeks for non-emergency admissions. If you weren't actively dying in front of someone, you waited. The nearest psychiatrist, not a general practitioner, not a nurse practitioner, but an actual board-certified psychiatrist capable of evaluating and treating stimulant-induced psychosis, was in Charleston, 90 minutes away under ideal conditions. That psychiatrist was accepting new patients on a 3-month wait list and didn't accept Medicaid, which was the only insurance Travis had. The local clinic in Welch had lost its physician in 2023 when the doctor retired, and the practice couldn't recruit a replacement. Rural physician shortages in West Virginia had been accelerating for a decade. Medical school graduates were not moving to dying coal towns to build practices. The clinic was now staffed by a nurse practitioner who was competent, dedicated, and completely out of her depth when it came to managing active stimulant psychosis. She could recognize it. She could not treat it. This wasn't McDowell County's failure specifically. It was the predictable outcome of decades of systematic disinvestment in rural healthcare infrastructure, accelerated by the economic collapse of the coal industry and the cascading damage of the opioid epidemic, which had burned through medical resources in the region for 15 years before P2P Meth arrived to find the cupboard nearly bare. Travis knew on some level that something was wrong with him. Even inside the psychosis, even while the hum from the refrigerator felt like a broadcast aimed at his specific consciousness, there were moments of relative clarity. Brief windows, usually in the morning after the rare nights he managed 4 or 5 hours of sleep, when the volume of the delusions dropped enough for something like self-awareness to surface. During one of those windows in August 2025, he called a substance abuse hotline. He sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, and made the call. This is not a small thing. Addiction specialists will tell you that the moment a person reaches for help, actually picks up the phone, actually dials, represents a neurological and psychological feat that shouldn't be underestimated, particularly for someone whose decision-making infrastructure is being actively dismantled by the substance they're addicted to. He was placed on hold for 14 minutes. Then he spoke to someone who was clearly reading from a script, who took his information, confirmed his county of residence, and told him he'd be placed on a callback list for local resource referrals. He asked how long. The voice on the phone said it could be up to 2 weeks for the callback. 2 weeks. Travis set the phone down. He sat there for a moment. Then the window of clarity began to close. You could almost feel it, the way fog rolls back in after a brief morning burn-off, and the hum that was never actually a broadcast resumed its hold on his attention, and the moment was gone. He never called again. What happened in the following weeks illustrated something about the geography of addiction that statistics alone can't fully capture. Because it wasn't just the distance to treatment that trapped people like Travis. It was the entire texture of daily life in a place where the drug was the most accessible thing on offer. P2P Meth in McDowell County in 2025 cost between $2 and $4 per dose. That price point wasn't accidental. It was the result of a supply chain so refined, so efficient, and so thoroughly embedded in the local economy that it functioned with the reliability of a utility. The cartels that manufactured P2P meth in industrial quantities in Mexico had, over the preceding decade, developed distribution networks that reached into rural Appalachia with a consistency that would have been impressive in a legitimate business context. Product moved. Supply met demand. Prices stayed low because volume was high and competition kept margins thin. $4. A therapy session, if you could find one and afford one, cost between $80 and $200. A psychiatric evaluation started at $300. A 30-day inpatient treatment program, even at a state-subsidized facility, involved waiting lists, paperwork, transportation logistics, and the practical impossibility of simply stopping your life for a month when you have no one to cover your bills, feed your animals, or keep the heat on in your house. The drug was $4 and available within walking distance. Recovery was expensive, distant, and came with a waiting period measured in weeks. This is not a moral equation. It's a logistical one. And the logistics, in rural Appalachia in 2025, pointed in one direction only. Travis's mother, Patricia, had been watching her son's deterioration with the particular helplessness of someone who understands the problem clearly, but possesses none of the tools to address it. She was 61 years old, on a fixed income, and had no car reliable enough for a 90-mile round trip in mountain weather. She'd raised Travis alone after his father left, worked 30 years at a grocery store that had since closed, and possessed the specific brand of stubborn love that rural Appalachian mothers seem to develop, the kind that keeps showing up even when showing up accomplishes nothing visible. She drove to Travis's house twice a week through the summer of 2025. She brought food he mostly didn't eat. She noticed the garbage bags on the windows. She noticed the weight loss. She noticed the way conversations had started to require a kind of navigation. Following Travis's logic meant accepting premises she knew weren't real, and correcting the premises sent him somewhere cold and unreachable. She called the county health department once in September. She explained the situation. She was told that unless her son was an immediate danger to himself or others, there were no grounds for involuntary intervention. She was given a pamphlet number to call. The pamphlet number directed her to the same hotline Travis had called in August. Patricia had lived in McDowell County her entire life. She had watched the coal industry die, the opioid crisis arrive, the schools empty, the storefronts shutter. She was not naive about the relationship between her community and institutional support. But something about the experience of calling the health department and being offered a pamphlet while her son sat 20 minutes away talking to a refrigerator hum, something about that specific moment cracked something in her that hadn't cracked before. She sat in her car outside the health department and didn't start the engine for a long time. Meanwhile, the world Travis moved through was simultaneously shrinking and expanding in ways that mapped precisely onto the architecture of his psychosis. Physically, his range contracted. He left the house less, drove less, interacted with fewer people. The paranoia about Gerald had metastasized beyond the neighbor and now included several other figures on the periphery of his daily life. The man who drove the mail truck, a woman he'd seen twice in the parking lot of the gas station, and, most recently, a specific black pickup truck that he believed he'd seen in 3 separate locations in 1 week. He kept a notebook. This detail matters because it demonstrates the particular cruelty of P2P psychosis. It doesn't make people incoherent, it makes them hypercoherent. Travis's notebook was meticulous. Dates, times, license plate numbers partially remembered, maps of routes he'd observed, patterns he'd identified. The handwriting was neat. The logic was tight. The conclusions were completely untethered from reality, but the methodology was that of someone trying very hard to understand something real and important. He'd been a good mechanic for the same reason. He noticed things, he tracked patterns, he followed logic from symptom to cause. The drug had taken that exact cognitive style and aimed it at phantoms. By October 2025, Travis had been using P2P Meth for 18 months. He weighed 141 pounds, down from 185 at the start. He was sleeping an average of 3 hours per night. He had not spoken to his daughter Emma in 6 weeks, not because he didn't love her, but because something in the circuitry of planning and initiating had begun to malfunction, and calling her required a sequence of decisions that increasingly felt insurmountable. And then, on a Wednesday night in the second week of October, something happened that his mother would later describe as the moment she understood that the situation had moved beyond anything she knew how to respond to. Travis called her at 11:30 p.m. Not unusual, he called at odd hours sometimes. But this call was different in a way she felt before she could articulate why. He wasn't distressed. He wasn't crying or agitated. He was calm, methodical. He explained to her, with the patient tone of someone conveying important information to a person who might not immediately grasp its significance, that he had figured something out. He'd been tracking the patterns in his notebook for weeks, and now he understood. The hum, the truck, Gerald, the woman at the gas station, the automatic doors at Walmart breathing. It was all connected. Patricia listened. She didn't interrupt. She held the phone and listened to her son explain a vast and intricate system of surveillance and meaning that had assembled itself piece by piece from the raw material of electrical hums and familiar streets, and the perfectly ordinary paranoia of a person who'd been sleeping 3 hours a night for months, while a neurotoxic substance methodically rewired his brain. When he finished, she said something gentle and non-committal, and told him she'd see him Friday. She hung up the phone, sat in her kitchen, and for the first time used the word to herself that she'd been avoiding for months. Not stressed, not struggling, not going through a hard time. Gone. She sat with that word for a long time. Then she got up, turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, because there was nothing else to do at 11:30 on a Wednesday night in a county with no psychiatrist, a broken phone number for help, and winter coming. There's a specific moment in the progression of P2P psychosis that clinicians have identified across hundreds of case studies, a threshold, invisible from the outside, where the psychosis stops being episodic and becomes the default state. Before the threshold, the person has psychotic episodes. After it, the person lives inside the psychosis and occasionally surfaces. The difference sounds subtle. It isn't. It's the difference between a flood that recedes and one that doesn't. Travis crossed that threshold sometime in November 2025. The clearest evidence wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. What Patricia noticed on her Friday visits was that the periods of relative normalcy, the moments when Travis seemed like Travis, when his eyes focused and his responses connected to the actual conversation, were getting shorter. In September, she might get an hour of something resembling her son before he drifted. In October, 20 minutes. By November, she was measuring it differently. Not in minutes, but in exchanges. 4 sentences that made sense. Then the 5th one went somewhere else entirely and he didn't come back. What was happening neurologically was a process that researchers describe as psychotic consolidation, the point where delusional belief systems stop being intrusive thoughts that disrupt normal cognition and start becoming the cognitive framework through which all new information is processed. Once this happens, reality doesn't correct the delusions. Reality feeds them. Every normal event becomes evidence. Every coincidence becomes confirmation. The system is closed, self-reinforcing, and impermeable to outside logic because outside logic is being filtered through the very framework it would need to dismantle in order to be heard. Travis's notebook had 47 pages of entries by November. Dense, neat, cross-referenced. The specific content of his delusions followed patterns that have been documented so consistently in P2P psychosis cases that researchers began calling them signature presentations, almost like diagnostic fingerprints. The surveillance belief came first, always, the conviction that one is being watched, followed, or monitored. Then the broadcast belief, the sense that signals, sounds, or messages are being directed specifically at the individual. Then, in the more advanced cases, the persecution narrative that ties both together into a coherent explanatory system. Travis had all three, fully developed, by late November. But P2P psychosis had a fourth signature presentation that was less commonly discussed, perhaps because it was harder to document, harder to quantify, and in some ways harder to look at directly. Researchers called it affective flattening with preserved delusional intensity. In plain language, the emotional warmth drains away while the paranoid beliefs stay vivid. The person stops laughing, stops expressing joy or tenderness, stops responding to warmth with warmth, but remains entirely capable of fear, suspicion, and the cold, focused attention of someone tracking a threat. Travis stopped laughing in November. His mother noticed it the way you notice when background music you'd stopped consciously hearing suddenly cuts out. Through the absence, not the presence. He hadn't been a man who laughed loudly or often, but he'd had a dry, quiet humour, the kind that surfaces in small moments, a raised eyebrow, a half smile at something absurd. It had been one of the things Kelsey had loved about him early on. It had been the thing his daughter Emma responded to most reliably when she visited. By November, it was gone, completely, as though the circuitry that produced it had been quietly switched off at the breaker. Emma visited on a Saturday in late November. She was 13 years old, driven by her mother Kelsey, who waited in the car in the driveway because the inside of the house had become a place Kelsey no longer felt comfortable entering. Patricia had told Kelsey about the garbage bags, the notebook, the 11:30 p.m. phone call. Kelsey had processed this information the way people process information they don't have a framework for, by filing it under worse than before, without fully confronting its implications. Emma went inside alone. She found her father in the kitchen, sitting at the table with the notebook open and a pen in his hand. He looked up when she came in, and for 30 seconds, a duration that Emma would later be able to describe with uncomfortable precision because she counted, he looked at her without recognition, not through her, not past her, at her, with the focused, evaluating attention of someone trying to determine whether a stranger at the door was a threat. Then something shifted in his face. Recognition arrived, not gradually, like a light dimming up, but in a single step like a switch. He knew her. He stood up. He crossed the room and hugged her, and Emma, who was 13 and trying very hard not to cry, hugged him back. She could feel his spine through his shirt in a way that hadn't been true 6 months ago. He held on longer than usual. When he stepped back, his eyes were wet. He sat back down at the table. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Emma. He said something about her hair, that it was longer, that it looked nice. And it was a normal sentence, a dad sentence, the kind that would have been unremarkable in any other context but felt, in this kitchen with the garbage bag windows and the meticulous notebook and the 30 seconds of non-recognition, like something fragile balanced on a very narrow ledge. They sat together for 40 minutes. Travis drank coffee. Emma talked about school, carefully, navigating the conversation the way you navigate a room in the dark, testing each step before committing weight to it. He listened. He responded. He was present for most of it. Then, near the end, he leaned forward and asked her, very quietly, whether she'd noticed the black pickup truck on the road outside her school. Emma said she hadn't. Travis nodded slowly as though her answer confirmed something rather than contradicted it. That night, after Emma left, after the taillights of Kelsey's car disappeared down the road, Travis used. The timeline of that evening is reconstructible from what came later. The pattern was consistent enough that it had become a kind of terrible routine. The visit created something that was almost feeling, something warm and painful and connected that the damaged serotonin system couldn't sustain. When it faded, and it faded fast, the grey nothing that replaced it was worse than the baseline grey, because it had the shadow of something better still attached to it. The drug removed the shadow. It removed everything briefly and replaced it with the chemical simulation of certainty and energy. He used. He stayed awake. He worked in the notebook until 4 a.m, cross-referencing the week's observations, and then he sat by the window, not looking out, just sitting near it, until dawn put grey light on the garbage bags and another day began. Emma, riding home in the back seat of her mother's car, said nothing for a long time. Then she asked Kelsey a question. The question was simple, and it was the kind of question that 13-year-olds ask when they're trying to construct a framework for something that doesn't fit any framework they've been given yet. She asked whether her dad was going to be okay. Kelsey drove for a moment without answering. The road curved through dark hills. The heater ran. And then she said something. Not the truth, not a lie, but the specific kind of non-answer that parents give when the truth is something they haven't finished processing themselves. Emma understood, from the non-answer, everything she needed to know. She turned and looked out the window at the dark hills moving past, and she didn't ask again. December arrived, and with it a development that no one in Travis's life had anticipated, not because it was unforeseeable in retrospect, but because the progression had been so gradual that each new step felt like a small increment, rather than a crossing of a significant line. Travis stopped leaving the house. Not entirely, not all at once. But the radius of his daily movement contracted to the point where, by the second week of December, he was making 1 trip per week to resupply both food and meth, and otherwise remaining inside. The outside world had become, in the architecture of his psychosis, too heavily surveilled to navigate comfortably. Inside the house, the parameters were known. The garbage bags controlled the sight lines. The notebook documented the patterns. The hum, which he'd now fully accepted as a broadcast, was manageable if you knew how to listen to it correctly. Outside, variables were uncontrolled. Anything could mean anything. The interpretive burden was exhausting. Inside, at least, the system was his. Patricia noticed the shift immediately when she came on a Friday and found food she'd left the previous Tuesday still sitting on the counter, untouched. Not spoiled. He'd eaten some of it. But the quantity made clear he wasn't eating consistently or significantly. She opened the refrigerator. There was almost nothing in it. The food she brought was disappearing slowly, which meant his caloric intake over an entire week was what a healthy adult consumes in a day. She stood in his kitchen and did the math she'd been avoiding for months. He weighed, at this point, somewhere around 135 pounds. He was barely eating. He was sleeping almost nothing. He was using daily, possibly more than daily. He hadn't left the house in close to 2 weeks. And somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the notebook and the garbage bags and the broadcast hum, there was the neurological reality that no one had officially named for Patricia yet, but that she had named for herself on a Wednesday night in October. She looked at her son sitting at the kitchen table, bent over the notebook with careful attention and understood, with a particular clarity that arrives when you stop arguing with a thing and simply look at it, that she was not watching someone who was going to find his way back on his own. The question she couldn't answer, standing in that kitchen in December 2025, was whether anyone else was going to come. The answer, when it came, didn't arrive through any of the channels Patricia had tried. No hotline callback, no health department intervention, no long-awaited referral materializing from the system she'd contacted in September. It came because of the cold. West Virginia December is serious. Temperatures dropping below freezing, wind moving through the hills with efficiency, old houses losing heat through walls and windows that have never been properly insulated. Travis's house was heated by a propane system that required a tank refill he'd been putting off because the sequence of decisions it required — call the propane company, arrange payment, be home when they came, interact with the driver — had become, in the framework of his psychosis, a process freighted with too many uncontrolled variables. The tank ran out on a Thursday night in mid-December. The temperature inside the house dropped to 38 degrees before morning. Travis, who had been awake for the preceding 30 hours, didn't fully register the cold in the way a person operating with a functional threat assessment system would. He put on more layers. He sat closer to the stove, which was electric, providing no heat. He pulled blankets around himself at the kitchen table and kept working in the notebook. Patricia found him like that on Friday morning. Her weekly visit, arriving at 9 a.m., walking into a house that was barely warmer than outside. Her son sitting at the table in 3 layers of clothing with a blanket over his shoulders, pen still in hand, notebook open, writing. She called the propane company herself. She sat with him while the heat came back. She made him eat something. She watched him eat it with the mechanical joylessness of someone fueling a machine rather than feeding a hunger. And she made a decision, quietly, in the kitchen of a house that was slowly warming back to survivable, that she should have been supported in making months earlier by a system that should have made it easier, in a county that should never have been left with so little. She decided she was going to make noise, not gentle phone calls, not polite inquiries directed at hotline scripts. Noise. The kind that required someone to respond with something other than a pamphlet number and a waiting list. What happened next moved faster than anything in the preceding 18 months, but it didn't move fast enough. While Patricia was sitting in a warming kitchen in McDowell County deciding to make noise, researchers at 3 separate universities were sitting with data that told the same story Travis was living, except scaled to tens of thousands of people across rural America, rendered in spreadsheets and clinical assessments and mortality statistics that somehow managed to be both staggering and invisible at the same time. The numbers, when laid out plainly, are not easy to absorb. Between 2020 and 2025, meth-related emergency room visits in rural counties across the United States increased by 318%. Not in urban centers, where resources existed to partially absorb the increase. In rural counties specifically, the McDowell counties, the places with 1 clinic and a retired doctor, and a waiting list that stretched past the point of usefulness. Stimulant-related deaths, which had been a footnote in the overdose statistics dominated by opioids throughout the 2000s and 10s, had by 2025 become the fastest-growing category of drug mortality in 7 states. But the death numbers, as grim as they were, didn't capture the most significant dimension of the crisis, because P2P Meth, uniquely among the major drugs driving America's addiction epidemic, was generating a category of survivor that the public health system had no protocol for. People who weren't dying, but who were no longer functioning. People who had crossed the threshold Travis was approaching and come out the other side into a state of chronic treatment-resistant psychosis that placed them in a category that existing systems were genuinely unprepared to manage. The living casualty count was invisible in the data, and it was enormous. A research team at the University of California, San Francisco published a study in late 2024 that sent something close to a shockwave through addiction medicine circles, though it barely registered in mainstream news, competing as it was with election coverage and economic anxiety, and the general noise of a country with too many crises and too little attention to distribute among them. The study tracked 847 individuals diagnosed with stimulant-induced psychosis across rural counties in 6 states over a 3-year period. The findings were specific and devastating. Of the subjects who had used P2P Meth for longer than 18 months before their first psychiatric intervention, fewer than 28% showed full remission of psychotic symptoms at the 12-month follow-up, even with consistent treatment, which a majority of subjects in rural areas could not access consistently anyway. 28%. That meant nearly 3/4 of people who used P2P Meth for a year and a half or more and developed psychosis were still psychotic, measurably, clinically psychotic, a full year after anyone tried to help them, and that figure assumed help was available, which in counties like McDowell it frequently wasn't. The study's lead researcher gave one interview to a medical podcast that reached approximately 4,000 listeners. She described what she was seeing in the data as a slow-motion mass casualty event with no incident commander. Travis, by the time this study was published, had been using for 20 months. To understand why the numbers were this bad, specifically in rural areas, you have to understand what happened to rural America's mental health infrastructure in the decade before P2P Meth arrived. The opioid crisis of the 2000s was, among other things, a stress test of rural public health systems, and the systems failed it. Not because the people working in them were incompetent or indifferent, but because the systems were already operating on margins so thin that any significant increase in demand produced collapse. Funding cuts at the state level throughout the 2000s had closed psychiatric beds, eliminated community mental health programs, and accelerated the physician exodus from rural areas that had been building for decades. By the time P2P Meth psychosis began generating patients who needed long-term psychiatric management, not detox, not a 72-hour hold, but sustained, specialized, ongoing psychiatric care, the infrastructure that would have provided that care in a functioning system simply did not exist in most rural counties. West Virginia had lost 32% of its psychiatric inpatient beds between 2010 and 2023. Kentucky had lost 28%. Oklahoma, which was being hit with the same P2P wave, had reduced its community mental health funding by 40% over the same period. These weren't anomalies, they were a pattern, a systematic withdrawal of the exact resources that would have been needed to catch people like Travis before they fell past the point of easy return. The system didn't fail in 2025. It had been failing for 15 years. P2P Meth just arrived to find the net already gone. What made the 2025 to 2026 crisis distinctly worse than the opioid epidemic that preceded it, and the opioid epidemic was catastrophic, so this comparison carries weight, was the nature of what P2P Meth left behind in communities. Opioid addiction, at its most brutal, killed people or pushed them into recovery. The dead were mourned, the recovering were supported, imperfectly but visibly. Communities could, with effort and resources, begin to rebuild around the losses. P2P Meth psychosis produced a third category that opioids largely hadn't. People who were alive, who were mobile, who were present in communities, but who were operating in an alternate reality that made sustained relationships, employment, and self-care impossible. In counties experiencing high concentrations of chronic P2P users, the social fabric tore in specific ways. Neighbours who had previously looked after each other began locking doors that had been left open for decades, not out of malice, but because the unpredictability of someone in active P2P psychosis created a specific kind of ambient fear that was different from the grief of opioid losses. Schools in affected counties reported increases in what teachers were describing as secondary trauma presentations in children, kids showing hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, and attachment disruption that mapped precisely onto the experience of living in a home with a P2P psychotic parent. Teachers in McDowell County specifically had, by late 2025, developed informal protocols for identifying children who might be living in these situations, not because anyone had trained them, but because the need was so constant and visible that they'd had to develop something. Emma, Travis's daughter, was in Charleston and largely insulated from this particular dynamic, but she wasn't insulated from its private version. She was 13 years old, getting mostly non-answers from her mother about her father's condition, carrying the weight of that 30 seconds of non-recognition every time she sat in a classroom and tried to concentrate on something that felt, by comparison, almost insultingly small. In communities where researchers had done on-the-ground documentation, interviewing residents, local officials, first responders, a phrase kept recurring with enough consistency that it started appearing in academic papers as a formal observation. People called it the new normal, not with acceptance. With exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that sets in when a crisis runs long enough that the abnormal stops registering as alarming and starts registering as ambient. First responders in rural counties described responding to the same individuals, the same addresses, dozens of times in a single year. Not because the system was working and catching the same people repeatedly, because the system had no mechanism to produce a different outcome, so the same outcome repeated until something drastic changed it. One paramedic in a county adjacent to McDowell described, in a documentary filmed in early 2026, responding to the same address 23 times in 14 months. Same individual, same presentation. P2P psychosis crisis, sometimes with a medical complication, always with the same fundamental problem beneath it. Each response stabilized the immediate crisis. None addressed the underlying one. Between calls, the paramedic said, he thought about the person occasionally, wondered how they were doing, whether anything had changed. Then the call would come again, and he'd know the answer. The number 23 is not unusual in this context. It is, statistically, close to average for high-utilization P2P psychosis cases in rural counties with limited psychiatric resources. Travis had been the subject of exactly 0 emergency calls at this point. Not because his situation wasn't severe enough, but because the people around him, Patricia, the neighbour Gerald whom Travis feared but who was entirely ordinary, hadn't yet reached the specific threshold of alarm that triggers a 911 call. That threshold was approaching. There was one more dimension of the data that didn't appear in the studies because it was almost impossible to measure, but that every person working in rural addiction medicine in 2025 understood viscerally. P2P meth was getting stronger. The concentration of active compound in street-level P2P meth had been increasing steadily since 2020, as cartel manufacturing processes refined and competition kept prices low while potency climbed. What someone bought for $4 in McDowell County in 2025 was, by most laboratory analyses of seized samples, significantly more potent than what $4 would have purchased in the same county 3 years earlier. The price stayed flat. The damage per dose increased. This meant that the 18-month threshold the UCSF study had identified, The point past which full psychotic remission became unlikely was potentially contracting. People were reaching irreversible neurological damage faster than the existing research had been able to track, because the drug itself was evolving faster than the studies following it. Travis had been using for 20 months when Patricia decided to make noise. He had been using an increasingly potent substance for nearly 2 years. The UCSF data said that fewer than 28% of people in his position fully recovered. It said this assuming treatment was available. In McDowell County, in December 2025, treatment was not available. But something else was coming. Not designed, not coordinated, but inevitable in the way that things become inevitable when enough pressure builds in a system with no release valve. Travis was about to become visible to a part of the apparatus that hadn't seen him yet. Not the health system, not the social services system, not the addiction treatment system, which had failed to reach him through every available channel. The one system in rural America that never had a waiting list. The one that responded in minutes, not weeks. The call came in at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in January 2026. A neighbour, not Gerald, but a woman named Donna who lived 2 houses down and had been watching Travis's deterioration with quiet alarm for months, looked out her bedroom window and saw something that pushed her past the threshold she'd been sitting on since October. Travis was standing in the middle of the road, not walking, not crossing, standing, facing the direction of oncoming traffic that didn't exist at 3 a.m. on a rural West Virginia road in January. His arms slightly raised from his sides, his body positioned with the unmistakable posture of someone performing a task. He was directing traffic, not metaphorically. In his full, vivid, completely convincing reality, Travis Cole was standing at the intersection of 2 neural systems that had been systematically destroyed over 21 months, managing a flow of vehicles that existed entirely within the architecture of his damaged mind. He was cold. The temperature was 19 degrees Fahrenheit, but he wasn't shivering in any way that registered as distress. He was focused. He was working. Donna called 911. She described what she was seeing. The dispatcher sent a patrol car and an ambulance, standard protocol for an unknown welfare situation, and within 11 minutes, which is actually a reasonable response time for rural West Virginia, where distances between dispatch and location can add 20 minutes to any call, 2 McDowell County Sheriff's deputies and a 2-person EMS crew arrived on the scene. What they found required a rapid assessment that these particular responders were not specifically trained for, but had, through sheer repetition, developed a practical working knowledge of. The deputies approached Travis carefully, the way people approach situations where the variables are unclear and the person at the center of them is operating on a logic they can't predict. Travis didn't run. He didn't become aggressive. He turned toward them with the calm attention of someone interrupted during an important task, evaluated them briefly, and then, in a development that the deputies would later describe as simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling, simply complied. He got into the ambulance without resistance. He answered questions, name, age, address, with complete accuracy. He was oriented to basic facts about himself. What he was not oriented to was the surrounding reality, the January cold, the 3 a.m. darkness, the absence of any traffic on the road, the fact that he'd been standing outside in 19-degree weather in a flannel shirt for an unknown length of time. The EMS crew noted his vital signs. His heart rate was elevated significantly, not dangerously, but enough to flag. His temperature was 96.1, early hypothermia. His weight, estimated visually and later confirmed, was approximately 127 pounds. He was 34 years old and looked, in the harsh light of the ambulance interior closer to 50, he was transported to the nearest emergency room, a 34-minute drive, and admitted for evaluation. The ER physician on duty that night had, over the preceding 2 years, seen enough P2P psychosis presentations that the diagnosis took approximately 15 minutes. Stimulant-induced psychosis, severe, probable methamphetamine, malnutrition, mild hypothermia, elevated cardiac markers suggesting the heart had been working under sustained chemical stress for an extended period. The physician ordered a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. Under West Virginia law, this was the maximum duration for which a person could be held without either their consent or a court order establishing imminent danger. 72 hours, 3 days. For a condition that had been building for 21 months and had, in the opinion of the psychiatric consultant who evaluated Travis the following morning, almost certainly passed the point of reversibility through short-term intervention. 3 days to address 2 years of neurological damage. The psychiatric consultant was a woman who drove 2 hours from Charleston twice a week to cover evaluations at rural hospitals across 3 counties, one of a handful of psychiatrists who had taken on this role because someone had to, and there was no one else. She'd been doing it for 4 years. She had the specific effect of someone who had long ago made peace with operating inside a broken system, because the alternative was abandoning the people. The broken system was failing. She evaluated Travis on the morning of his 2nd day in the hospital. By this point, the antipsychotics he'd been given, haloperidol, a standard first-line treatment for acute psychosis, had produced a partial response. The acute agitation was gone. The broadcasting hum was quieter. The surveillance architecture of his delusions had softened from vivid certainty to something he could describe as maybe not quite right. The consultant noted all of this carefully. She also noted what the partial response revealed about the underlying damage, because the way a brain responds to antipsychotic medication tells you something about how much of its original architecture is still intact. Travis's partial response, while better than no response, suggested that the delusional structures had become sufficiently embedded that medication was managing symptoms rather than addressing causes. The building was still standing. The medication was just turning down the lights. She recommended long-term inpatient psychiatric treatment. She wrote this recommendation in her notes with the full knowledge that long-term inpatient psychiatric treatment was not something McDowell County, or the 5 counties surrounding it, could provide. The nearest facility with a capacity for long-term psychiatric placement had a waiting list of 6 to 8 weeks and prioritized court-ordered placements over voluntary admissions. Travis was not court-ordered. He had not hurt anyone. He had been standing in a road in the cold directing imaginary traffic. The system had very specific thresholds, and standing in a road directing imaginary traffic was above some of them and below others. On the morning of the 3rd day, something happened that illustrated the particular cruelty of the 72-hour hold mechanism with documentary precision. Travis woke up more lucid than he'd been in months. The combination of antipsychotics, 3 days of food, 3 nights of actual sleep, monitored, enforced sleep, in a warm room without the notebook and without the hum and without the variables of the outside world, had produced a window of clarity that was, by any measure, the clearest he'd been since early 2025. He was aware enough, in that window, to understand that something had been wrong. Not the full architecture of it, not the 21 months of progressive neurological damage laid out with clinical clarity, but the general shape of it. He felt the difference between where he was now and where he'd been, the way you feel the difference between dry land and water when you've been in the water for a long time without realizing you were drowning. He agreed to follow up with outpatient treatment. He agreed to take the medication. He signed the discharge paperwork with the cooperative sincerity of someone who genuinely, in that moment, intended to do exactly what they were agreeing to. He was given a prescription for antipsychotic medication, a 30-day supply. The prescription cost, without adequate insurance coverage, $340. Travis had $23 in his bank account. He was given a referral to an outpatient psychiatric clinic in a town 40 miles away, with an appointment scheduled for 6 weeks out. He was given a printed pamphlet about substance abuse resources, the same general category of document that the county health department had offered Patricia 4 months earlier. He was discharged at 11 a.m. Patricia picked him up. She drove him home. She watched him walk back into the house with the garbage bag still on the windows and the notebook still on the table, and she felt something that she later described as the specific despair of watching a door close that had briefly, improbably opened. The prescription went unfilled. Not immediately. Travis intended to fill it, the same way he'd intended to follow up, the same way he'd intended a lot of things over the preceding 2 years. But the pharmacy was 20 miles away and required money he didn't have, and a sequence of logistical decisions that, as the hospital enforced clarity faded over the following 48 hours, and the drugs pool reasserted itself with the patience of something that had been waiting rather than gone, became increasingly difficult to prioritize. By the end of the second day after discharge, he had used again. This outcome, rapid relapse following discharge from a short-term psychiatric hold, in the absence of bridge support, affordable medication, and accessible follow-up care, was not Travis's individual failure. It was a statistically documented pattern occurring across rural counties with such regularity that addiction researchers had given it a name. They called it the revolving door, though that phrase implied a system that was at least moving, which overstated the case somewhat. It wasn't a revolving door. It was a wall with a window in it. The window opened for 72 hours, let in light, then closed. The wall remained. What happened inside Travis's brain during those 48 hours after relapse was, from a neurological standpoint, measurably worse than what had been happening before hospitalization. Antipsychotic medication, when it's introduced and then abruptly discontinued, as it effectively was when Travis didn't fill the prescription, can produce a rebound effect. The brain, briefly stabilized, responds to destabilization with heightened sensitivity. The psychosis that returned after 48 hours was not identical to the psychosis that had preceded the hospitalization. It was sharper, more insistent, and it contained one new element that hadn't been prominent before. For the first time, Travis's delusions included people he loved. The surveillance network that had previously centered on Gerald, the mail truck driver, the black pickup truck, that architecture now had a new figure at its center. Someone who had access to him. Someone who visited regularly. Someone who had, in the logic of the paranoid system, been gathering information all along under the cover of concern. His mother. Patricia arrived on Friday as always, 2 days after he'd been discharged, carrying food and the fragile hope that the hospitalization had changed something. Travis opened the door. He looked at her, and the way he looked at her was different from every Friday before it. Not the flat affect of psychotic consolidation, not the partial recognition that had been his baseline for months. It was suspicion, direct, focused, unambiguous. She came in anyway. She put the food down. She stayed for 30 minutes, moving carefully through a conversation that felt like navigating a room where the floor might give way at any point, and then she left. She sat in her car in the driveway for a moment before starting the engine. She'd seen a lot of things in that house over the past year. The garbage bags, the notebook, the man who was her son looking at his daughter without recognition for 30 seconds. She'd absorbed all of it because absorbing things was what she did. It was the specific survival skill that life in McDowell County over 6 decades had refined in her to a high degree. But she hadn't seen him look at her like that before, like a threat. She started the engine and drove home, and for the first time since the whole thing began, she drove with her hands tight on the wheel the entire way. Not because the roads were bad, but because she needed to hold on to something solid while she thought about what had just changed. What had just changed was that the last reliable bridge between Travis Cole and the outside world had developed a crack that neither of them had put there. The drug had put it there, methodically, chemically, without malice or intention, just doing what it did. There's a photograph that addiction researchers sometimes use in presentations, not of a person, but of 2 brain scans placed side by side. The left scan shows a healthy brain, regions lit in warm colours indicating normal glucose metabolism, normal activity, normal function. The right scan shows the brain of a chronic methamphetamine user after 2 years of heavy use. The warm colours are largely gone. What remains is a pattern that neurologists, when they first began seeing it consistently in the mid-2000s, compared to the brain scans of people with severe traumatic brain injuries. Not similar to, compared to. P2P Meth produces this damage faster and deeper than the ephedrine-based methamphetamine those early scans documented. By January 2026, Travis Cole's brain, had anyone scanned it, which no one had, because getting an MRI in McDowell County required a referral, transportation and insurance coverage that cooperated, none of which Travis currently had, would have shown damage consistent with someone who had experienced repeated concussive trauma over several years. He was 34 years old. His brain looked older than his mother's. The physical destruction that P2P Meth produces operates on several parallel tracks simultaneously, which is part of what makes it so efficient as a wrecking mechanism. It doesn't choose between destroying the mind or the body. It does both, concurrently, with the thoroughness of something that has no other agenda. Start with the cardiovascular system, because that's where the most immediately life-threatening damage accumulates. Methamphetamine is a powerful vasoconstrictor. It causes blood vessels to narrow, forces the heart to work harder to push blood through a constricted system, and elevates blood pressure to levels that, sustained over months and years, cause the kind of damage that cardiologists typically see in patients in their late 50s and 60s. Travis's resting heart rate, measured during his January hospitalization, was 98 beats per minute. Normal resting heart rate for a 34-year-old male is between 60 and 80. His blood pressure was 148/94, stage 2 hypertension, the category where cardiologists begin having serious conversations about stroke risk. His EKG showed a pattern called QT prolongation, an irregularity in the heart's electrical rhythm that, under sufficient chemical stress, can progress to a potentially fatal arrhythmia with very little warning. The ER physician noted all of this. She noted it in the chart, flagged it for follow-up, and discharged him 72 hours later, because the system gave her no other option. The cardiac damage wasn't going anywhere. It would be there when the next call came. Move from the heart to the kidneys, which take their own category of punishment from sustained meth use. The kidneys filter blood. When blood pressure is chronically elevated and the chemical composition of the blood is repeatedly disrupted by stimulant flooding, the filtration system degrades. Travis's kidney function markers, measured during the hospitalization, showed early-stage damage, not yet critical, but trending in a direction that had one destination if nothing changed. Then the teeth, which have become the visual shorthand for meth addiction in popular culture. The meth mouth phenomenon that public health campaigns used extensively in the 2000s. The mechanism is specific. Meth causes severe dry mouth by suppressing saliva production. and saliva is the primary defense mechanism against the bacteria that cause tooth decay. No saliva, combined with the teeth grinding that meth produces and the complete collapse of self-care routines that severe addiction involves, creates a dental disaster that progresses faster than most people without dental training realize is physiologically possible. Travis had lost 7 teeth by January 2026. The remaining teeth were in various stages of decay. He hadn't seen a dentist in 3 years. This isn't vanity. Dental infections can become systemic infections, and systemic infections in a person with a compromised immune system and a heart already showing arrhythmia markers become a genuinely serious medical event. But the teeth and the kidneys and even the heart damage were, in a terrible calculus, the secondary damage. The primary damage, the damage that determined everything else about Travis's life and future, was happening in the 3 pounds of tissue inside his skull. The brain damage from chronic P2P meth use operates in 3 distinct but interconnected areas, each producing its own category of functional impairment. Understanding all 3 is necessary to understand why Travis was not, by January 2026, simply a person making bad choices. He was a person whose choice-making apparatus had been substantially dismantled. The first area is the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, decision-making, impulse control, and the ability to weigh long-term consequences against short-term impulses. This is the part of the brain that, in a non-addicted person, sits between an urge and an action and performs a rapid cost-benefit analysis. Meth damages this region through a combination of neurotoxicity and the structural changes produced by chronic dopamine dysregulation. In advanced cases, the damage is visible on MRI as reduced grey matter density, physically less brain tissue in the region responsible for the functions most central to voluntary behaviour change. When a judge in a rural courtroom looks at someone like Travis and asks why he didn't just stop, why, knowing what the drug was doing, he kept choosing it, the answer is lodged partly in this damaged tissue. The mechanism that would generate and sustain that choice was compromised by the same substance the choice would require him to stop taking. It is, neurologically, a near-perfect trap. The second area is the white matter, the connective tissue between brain regions that allows different parts of the brain to communicate efficiently. Chronic meth use damages white matter through a process called oxidative stress, essentially burning out the insulation on the brain's wiring. The result is a brain that has the components, but can't connect them reliably, like a house where the rooms still exist but the hallways between them have been damaged, so getting from one to another takes longer, produces unexpected results, or sometimes fails entirely. This is why Travis's responses in conversation had begun to have that quality of slight delay, of arriving from a distance. The signal was travelling through damaged infrastructure. The third area is the one that produced the most visible and frightening symptoms, the mesolimbic pathway, the brain's reward and reality filtering system. This is where the psychosis lived. This is where the breathing doors came from, and the broadcast hum, and the surveillance network, and the new conviction that his mother was gathering information against him. The mesolimbic pathway, under sustained P2P meth assault, had stopped filtering accurately between internal and external reality, and the damage to this filtering system, unlike a broken bone or even a damaged organ, did not repair itself reliably with time and abstinence. There was one more dimension of physical destruction that rarely made it into the clinical descriptions but was, for the people experiencing it, possibly the most totalizing. Researchers called it anhedonia, the complete inability to experience pleasure from anything other than the drug. The word comes from Greek, an meaning without, hedon meaning pleasure. Travis had not experienced genuine pleasure, Not from food, not from warmth, not from human connection, not from anything, in months. His brain's natural reward system had been so thoroughly overwhelmed and then depleted that it had essentially stopped generating the chemical signals that make ordinary life feel worth living. This is not depression in the colloquial sense. It's not sadness. It's the absence of the neurochemical substrate that makes positive experience register as positive. Food is fuel without taste. Warmth is a physical condition without comfort. The presence of his daughter produced a flicker, something the brain's damaged system strained toward. But the signal was weak and brief, and followed immediately by the grey flatness that had become his default state. The only thing that cut through the grey was the drug. Not because the drug felt good anymore. The euphoria of the early months was long gone, but because it was the only stimulus powerful enough to register at all. He used not to get high. He used to feel something. Anything. The distinction matters more than most people realize. By February 2026, Travis weighed 127 pounds. His hair, which had been thick, was thinning at the temples. The skin on his face had the specific texture that chronic meth users develop. Dull, slightly loose, aged in a way that doesn't match the underlying bone structure. He moved carefully, conserving energy with the unconscious efficiency of a body running on insufficient fuel. He was 34 years old and his body was conducting itself like a much older machine that had been run without maintenance for a very long time. What he experienced from inside this deteriorating physical reality was something that the medical literature described with clinical detachment, but that defied clinical detachment when you tried to actually imagine it. During one of the brief windows of relative clarity that still occasionally surfaced, rarer now, shorter, but not yet entirely gone, Travis sat at his kitchen table in February and experienced something that wasn't quite self-awareness but was adjacent to it. A sense of the distance between who he was and who he had been. Not framed in those words, not organized into a coherent narrative, but felt, the way phantom limb pain is felt, the sensation of something that should be there generating a signal from its own absence. He had been a mechanic. He had known how engines worked. He had been able to hear a problem and find it and fix it, and there had been satisfaction in that, the specific satisfaction of competence, of applying knowledge precisely and having it produce the intended result. That satisfaction was gone, not just the job, the capacity for that kind of satisfaction. The wiring that would have connected "I did something well" to "that feels good" was damaged. He sat at the table and held that absence for a moment. The duration of the window didn't allow for much longer. And then the window closed, and the notebook was on the table, and the hum was in the walls, and the grey nothing folded back in over everything like a tide. He picked up the pen. He opened the notebook to a fresh page. And he began, with meticulous care, to document the day's observations, because the notebook was the one thing that still felt like purpose, even if the purpose it served existed only inside a reality that no one else could enter, and that was, with each passing week, becoming more difficult for even the damaged, diminished version of Travis Cole to navigate safely. Outside, February moved through McDowell County with the indifferent efficiency of weather that doesn't know it's documenting the backdrop of a catastrophe. The hills were grey, the road was empty. Gerald's house was dark, as it usually was in the morning, because Gerald was an ordinary man who slept normal hours and had no idea he'd been installed as a central figure in his neighbour's elaborate internal mythology. Everything was quiet. Too quiet, Travis noted in the notebook. That meant they were being careful. He underlined it twice and kept writing. There's a concept in neuroscience called allostatic load, the cumulative biological cost of sustained stress on a system that was designed for short-term crisis, not chronic assault. Every system has a threshold past which the damage stops being recoverable through rest and starts being structural. Bones heal. Some brain regions don't. The distinction between damage that reverses and damage that doesn't is invisible from the outside and often invisible from the inside, which is part of what makes it so dangerous. Travis crossed his allostatic threshold somewhere in February 2026. No one marked it. There was no clinical moment, no test result, no event that announced it. It emerged gradually from the accumulation of everything preceding it. 23 months of P2P Meth, the January hospitalization that stabilized nothing, the rapid relapse, the cardiac markers trending in the wrong direction, the psychosis that had returned from the brief medication window sharper and more personal than before. What changed in February wasn't dramatic. It was the difference between a structure that is damaged but standing, and one that is damaged past the point where standing is something it's doing, rather than something that's temporarily not yet finished. The psychiatry consultant who had evaluated him in January would later review his case notes and identify February as the probable inflection point. Not because of any single event, but because of the pattern. The pattern said that the window had closed. The first concrete evidence that something had fundamentally shifted came through Patricia, because Patricia was still the only person seeing Travis with any regularity. She'd continued her Friday visits despite the new quality of suspicion he'd turned on her after the hospitalization, continued them because stopping felt like abandonment, and because she was, underneath the fear, still his mother, and that fact didn't have an off switch. But February's visits were different from everything before them. The suspicion that had appeared in Travis's eyes after the discharge had not faded with time. It had organized itself. In the architecture of his psychosis, Patricia had been assigned a specific role. Not a vague threatening presence, but a defined function within the surveillance network he'd been documenting for months. She visited regularly, she asked questions about his daily patterns, she brought food, and observed how much he ate. In the delusional framework, this was not maternal concern. It was systematic data collection. He let her in on Fridays because, within the logic of the system, keeping her close was tactically preferable to pushing her away and losing visibility on her activities. This reasoning, paranoid, inverted, built entirely on false premises, was nonetheless internally coherent. It followed rules. It had a structure. The structure just had nothing to do with reality. Patricia didn't know she'd been assigned a role. She came on Fridays, she brought food, she watched her son across a kitchen table that had become the widest distance she'd ever experienced, and she tried to find him in there somewhere. Some Fridays she found a trace, most Fridays she didn't. The moment that ended the Friday visits happened on the 3rd week of February, and it happened fast, the way things that have been building slowly tend to, arriving with sudden violence after a long quiet approach. Patricia had come at her usual time. She'd put food in the refrigerator. She'd sat down at the table. Travis had been, for the first 20 minutes, in one of the flatter states. Not present exactly, but not acutely paranoid either, just somewhere else. Fingers moving against the edge of the table in a pattern that had no obvious source. Then something shifted. A sound outside, a car passing on the road, entirely ordinary, registered in Travis's threat assessment system as something else entirely. His body changed before his face did. The fingers stopped, the posture reorganized, and then he stood up. What followed lasted less than 2 minutes. He didn't touch her. That matters and should be stated clearly. But he moved toward her in a way that occupied the space between them, with a physical intention that Patricia, who knew her son's body language the way mothers know these things, understood immediately as a kind of threat she had never experienced from him before. He believed she had brought someone, that there was a person outside connected to her, completing the surveillance loop. His voice, when he spoke, was not raised. It was controlled and certain, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been, because shouting can be weathered, but certainty is a wall. Patricia left. She drove home. She sat in her kitchen for a long time without taking off her coat. Then she called the county health department, and then she called a legal aid office, and then she called Kelsey in Charleston, and in each call she used words she hadn't let herself use before: danger, involuntary, not safe. She did not call Travis that Friday, or the following Monday. For the first time in over a year, the phone between them went quiet. The silence in the house with the garbage bag windows registered in Travis's notebook as confirmation. She'd stopped because she'd been caught. The operation had changed phases. He wrote 4 pages that night, connecting threads he'd been tracking for months into a new configuration that explained the silence perfectly within the closed system of his beliefs. He wasn't scared by what he'd written. He was relieved. Understanding felt like safety, even when what you understood had no relationship to what was real. Kelsey had been managing Emma's exposure to the situation with the particular skill of a parent trying to protect a child from something the child already knows about. Emma was 13 and not unintelligent, and the 30 seconds of non-recognition in November had never left her. She'd stopped asking whether her father was going to be okay, not because she'd stopped wanting an answer, but because she'd understood from the non-answer she'd received that the honest answer was something no one in her life was prepared to say out loud. When Kelsey called her into the living room in late February and sat her down, Emma's face did something specific, a micro-expression that closed down, that prepared itself. 13 years old and already equipped with the emotional bracing mechanism of someone who had learned to anticipate bad news. Kelsey told her they weren't going to visit for a while. She used careful words. She didn't say dangerous. She didn't say the things Patricia had said in the phone call. But Emma was 13 and had been paying attention for the past year with the focused attention of someone who understands that the adults around them aren't giving full information, and full information might be the only thing that makes sense of what she's watching. She went to her room. She sat on her bed. She thought about her father in the house with the garbage bags on the windows and the notebook on the table and the 30 seconds of looking at her like a stranger. And then she thought about the hug, the one where she could feel his spine through his shirt, where he held on longer than usual. She thought about both things at once, which is one of the harder cognitive tasks that humans perform, and one that 13-year-olds should not have to perform about their parents. She didn't cry. She'd already done that privately more than once. What she did instead was open her phone and look at the last text message her father had sent her, from November, before the communication had become too unreliable to produce messages that made sense. It said he was proud of her, that she was the best thing, that he'd talk to her soon. She read it several times. Then she put the phone down and went to do her homework because life had the terrible momentum of continuing to require things from you regardless of what else was happening. With Patricia no longer visiting and Emma's contact cut off, Travis's social world contracted to a radius of essentially 0. The people who supplied the drug were not people he had relationships with. They were transactions, brief and functional. The neighbour Gerald, who occupied such a central role in Travis's internal landscape, had no idea he existed in anyone's mythology. Donna, who had called 911 in January, had been filing Travis under situation to monitor and keeping her distance. He was, by March 2026, almost entirely alone, not as a temporary circumstance, as a settled condition. The house reflected it. The food Patricia had stopped bringing was not replaced. Travis was eating irregularly, whatever required the least preparation, in quantities insufficient for someone his size even at 127 pounds. The heat was running, barely, on a propane tank he'd had refilled by sheer logistical accident when a neighbour had organised a group order and included him. The notebook had expanded to a second volume, purchased during one of his weekly resupply trips and filling with the same meticulous handwriting, the same cross-referenced observations, the same architecture of meaning built from material that existed only inside his head. He slept between 2 and 3 hours per night, sometimes less. Sleep deprivation, layered on top of everything else, was doing its own separate damage, because sleep is when the brain performs the maintenance functions that keep it operational. The glymphatic system, which clears metabolic waste from brain tissue, operates almost exclusively during sleep. A brain running on 2 hours of sleep per night is a brain accumulating its own toxic byproducts faster than it can clear them. Add P2P Meth's direct neurotoxicity on top of that accumulation, and the result is a neurological environment that is, by any clinical measure, hostile to the continued functioning of the organ it's supposed to sustain. Travis's brain, in March 2026, was running in conditions that no engineer would consider acceptable for any system they expected to continue operating. The thing that no one outside could see, the thing that made the situation more complicated than the clinical picture already suggested, was that Travis, inside the damaged system, was not experiencing his life as collapse. He was experiencing it as clarity. The psychosis had reached a stage of full consolidation where the internal reality was not a frightening or chaotic place. It was ordered. It had rules. It had a logic that, within its own framework, explained everything. The silence from Patricia, the end of Emma's visits, the careful quiet of the neighbourhood. It all fit. It all made sense. The notebook was proof. The system was comprehensible. This is one of the most counterintuitive features of advanced stimulant psychosis, and one of the reasons intervention becomes so difficult at this stage. The person inside the delusion is not suffering from the delusion. They're sheltered by it. The paranoid architecture that looks from outside like obvious dysfunction provides, from inside the thing that the damaged brain needs most urgently, a coherent explanation for an experience that would otherwise be unbearable. Travis wasn't scared. He was vigilant. There's a difference that matters enormously for anyone trying to reach him. To reach a person who is scared, you offer safety. To reach a person who is vigilant against a threat they're certain is real, you are the threat, regardless of who you are or what you intend. Patricia had become the threat. The hospital had been the threat. The deputies at 3 a.m. in January had been part of it. There was no one left whose approach wouldn't register as danger. And somewhere beneath the consolidated delusion, beneath the vigilance and the notebook and the closed system of meaning, the physiological damage was continuing its quiet, incremental, entirely indifferent work. The cardiac markers that the ER physician had flagged in January were not static. They were trending. The QT prolongation was, under the continued chemical stress of daily P2P meth use and chronic sleep deprivation, progressing toward a threshold that had a name in cardiology. That name was not a metaphor. It was a medical event, specific, measurable, and, in the absence of the intervention that the 72-hour hold had failed to produce, increasingly probable. It arrived on a Tuesday in late March, not loudly, not dramatically. Not in the road this time, where someone could see, in the kitchen, at the table, with a notebook open and the pen in his hand and the hum in the walls and the grey West Virginia morning light coming through the spaces at the edges of the garbage bags. Travis felt something wrong in his chest, a flutter, a skip, a sensation that his heart had briefly lost its place. And then his vision went bright, and then dark, and he was on the floor beside the table, and the notebook was on the floor beside him, and the pen had rolled to the wall. He was conscious. Barely. Enough to know he was on the floor. Enough to feel the linoleum cold against his face. Not enough to get up, or reach the phone, or do anything except lie there while his heart, which had been working under impossible conditions for 23 months, tried to find its rhythm again. It did. Slowly. Unevenly. But it found something that worked well enough to keep him alive on the kitchen floor of a house that no one was going to walk into for the foreseeable future. He lay there for a long time. Then, because the brain is an extraordinary instrument even when it's badly damaged, and because survival instinct operates below the level of psychosis and below the level of conscious decision-making, he reached for the phone. The 911 call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Travis was on the floor when he made it, phone pressed sideways against his face, speaking in a voice that the dispatcher would later describe in her incident report as calm, flat, and difficult to understand. He gave his address correctly. He said his chest. He didn't say anything else that was fully coherent, but the address was enough. The ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. Faster than January, different crew, same rural roads. When they came through the unlocked door and found him on the kitchen floor beside the overturned chair and the open notebook, his heart was in a rhythm called atrial fibrillation. The upper chambers firing chaotically, the lower chambers trying to compensate, the whole system producing a cardiac output approximately 30% below what a body needs to function properly. His blood pressure was 74/50, critically low. His skin was grey. The crew worked fast. IV access, fluids, cardiac monitoring, oxygen. One of them, the same paramedic who would later say he'd responded to the same address 23 times, though this was only the second time for Travis specifically, recognised him from January. The recognition produced something in the paramedic's face that he kept professional and internal, but that was visible for a moment before he locked it down. They moved him in 8 minutes. The ER that received him was the same one as January, different physician on duty, same chart flagged on the system. The new physician read the January notes in approximately 90 seconds and understood the complete picture before Travis was fully through the door. The cardiac markers that had been trending, the P2P psychosis, the 72-hour hold that had changed nothing, the discharge into a system with no capacity to catch him. She ordered a cardioversion, a controlled electrical shock to reset the heart's rhythm, and within 40 minutes Travis Cole's heart was beating in something approaching a normal pattern for the first time in longer than anyone could document precisely. He was alive, technically, unambiguously alive. Everything else was considerably more complicated. The psychiatric consultant drove in from Charleston the following morning. She reviewed the January notes she'd written herself. She reviewed the new admission data. She sat with Travis for 90 minutes, longer than the standard evaluation, because something in the case warranted it, and because she had driven 2 hours and wasn't going to do this quickly. What she found was different from January in ways that the clinical language of her notes would partially capture and partially fail to. The antipsychotics from January had been in his system briefly and were long gone. There had been no medication for 10 weeks. The psychosis that presented in this evaluation was not the acute, agitated version from the road in January. It was settled, organised. It had the specific quality of something that had been living in a space for a long time and had arranged the furniture to its liking. She asked standard orientation questions. He answered them correctly. Name, date, location. He was cooperative in the way that someone is cooperative when they've assessed the situation and determined that cooperation serves their current strategic interest. She noted this distinction carefully because it mattered for what came next. She administered a structured psychosis assessment. The results placed him in the severe range on every subscale. Positive symptoms, negative symptoms, cognitive disorganization. But it was a specific finding on the cognitive subscale that she sat with longest, reviewing it twice before writing her notes. The score indicated that the cognitive impairment she was measuring was not fully consistent with active psychosis alone. It was consistent with something that had a different name, a longer, more permanent name. She wrote her notes, she made 2 phone calls. She requested a neurology consult, which required the neurologist to drive from a different facility and would take 2 days to arrange. Then she did something that wasn't in her standard protocol, but that she did anyway, because 20 years of practicing psychiatry in under-resourced rural environments had given her a set of habits that existed alongside the official ones. She found Patricia's number in the chart and called her. Patricia drove to the hospital that afternoon. She hadn't seen Travis since the February visit that had ended with her leaving in a coat she didn't take off for an hour. She'd spoken to Kelsey. She'd called the legal aid office. She'd been building, quietly and methodically, the documentation that a formal petition for involuntary commitment would require under West Virginia law, a process that moved slowly and required evidence of imminent danger that the system defined narrowly enough to exclude most of what she'd witnessed. She walked into Travis's room and stood at the door for a moment before he saw her. He was in a hospital bed, cardiac monitor attached, IV running, the grey March light coming through an actual window. No garbage bags here. And he looked, in the clinical white light of the room, like a man who had been used as a testing ground for something with no regard for the material being tested. The weight loss was starker in a hospital bed than it had been across a kitchen table. The skin, the hair, the way his hands lay on the blanket, all of it added up to a sum that Patricia took in through the specific comprehension of a mother who'd been watching a slow disaster for a year and a half and was now seeing its current position clearly for the first time. He looked at her when she came in. The suspicion that had been so acute in February was muted. The cardiac event, the medication they'd restarted, the sheer physical depletion had quieted things. He wasn't warm. He wasn't the Travis of 3 years ago who would have stood up when she came in. But he wasn't the Travis of February either, with the controlled voice and the certainty of threat. He was something in between, something depleted enough to be temporarily still. They sat together for a while. Patricia talked. Travis listened, or appeared to. The consultant had advised her to keep things simple, concrete, present tense, not to argue with his beliefs, not to challenge the framework, just to be in the room with him in a way that was human and real. She told him Emma had asked about him. This was true. Emma had asked Kelsey in the past week whether she could send her dad a text. Kelsey had said not yet. Emma had asked why not. Kelsey hadn't answered completely. Something moved in Travis's face when Patricia mentioned Emma. Not the full signal of what it would have been 2 years ago, but a trace. A flicker through the anhedonia, the damaged system straining toward the one input that still produced something resembling a response. He didn't say much, but he didn't look at Patricia like a threat. That was, by the current measure of things, significant. The neurology consult happened on day 3. The neurologist reviewed the psychiatric assessment, ordered an MRI, and spent 40 minutes with Travis running cognitive tests that Travis experienced as a conversation and the neurologist experienced as a data collection exercise with implications he was already beginning to see before the MRI results confirmed them. The MRI results came back on day 4. The consultant and the neurologist reviewed them together in a room down the hall from Travis's, standing at a screen displaying the scans in a format that made the damage visible in a way that clinical notes never quite managed. The white matter damage was extensive. Both hemispheres, the connectivity between prefrontal cortex and limbic system particularly affected. The grey matter reduction in the prefrontal region was measurable and significant. The neurologist said something that the consultant had been thinking since her first evaluation. but hadn't said out loud yet. He said it clinically, in the precise language of neurology, and the clinical language made it both clearer and somehow harder to hear than ordinary words would have. He said the damage was not consistent with a presentation that would be expected to fully resolve with treatment. Partial improvement was possible. Sustained psychiatric support, medication compliance, abstinence from meth, all of these could produce meaningful improvement in symptom management. The psychosis might become manageable rather than dominant. The cognitive deficits might stabilize. With intensive, long-term, consistent care, Travis Cole might be able to live a life that had structure and safety and some form of human connection. Full recovery to pre-morbid baseline, to the Travis who had fixed engines and made quiet jokes and held his daughter when she was small, was not something the scan supported as a realistic outcome. The consultant stood with that for a moment. Then she went back to her work because there was more of it, and standing with things for too long was a luxury that rural psychiatric coverage didn't offer. The legal mechanism that followed moved faster than anything in Travis's history with the system, faster than the hotline callback that never came, faster than the health department pamphlet, faster than the 6-week outpatient referral. Patricia's prior documentation, combined with the cardiac event, the MRI findings, and the psychiatric assessment, gave the court what it needed to issue an involuntary commitment order under West Virginia's mental hygiene statute. It took 11 days, which is fast for this system, which is also a sentence worth sitting with. Travis was transferred to a state psychiatric facility, one of 2 remaining in West Virginia that had capacity for long-term placement, both severely underfunded, both operating above recommended patient-to-staff ratios, both doing something that resembled the care they were designed to provide under conditions that made it harder than it should have been. He was given a bed, a consistent medication regimen, 3 meals a day, a psychiatric team that would see him regularly rather than once during a 72-hour window. For the first time in 24 months, the external conditions of Travis Cole's life were oriented towards stabilization rather than continued deterioration. The stabilization came slowly, unevenly, with setbacks, but it came. The psychosis quieted, not disappeared, but quieted, like a signal that's been turned down rather than switched off. The surveillance architecture lost some of its vividness. The hum that had dominated his internal landscape for over a year became intermittent, then occasional, then something he could identify as distinct from reality even when he heard it, which was not the same as not hearing it, but was a different and less totalizing relationship with it. He gained weight, 7 pounds in the first month, which sounds modest and represented given where he'd started, something closer to a rescue than a progress metric. The cardiac team managed his arrhythmia with medication. His blood pressure came down to a range that was still elevated but no longer in the immediate danger zone. His kidneys, the early-stage damage flagged in January, stabilized. His teeth were gone past saving. That particular damage was permanent and structural, and would require, at some future point when the larger emergencies had been addressed, a conversation about what was practical and what was possible, which was the kind of conversation that happened late in the recovery process, when the earlier ones had been resolved enough to make room for it. 3 outcomes dominate the documented trajectories of people in Travis's exact situation. People who have used P2P Meth for 2 or more years, developed severe persistent psychosis, experienced major cardiac events, and entered the long-term psychiatric care system in rural America. The first outcome is death. It arrives through cardiovascular failure, drug interaction during relapse, violence during a psychotic episode, or the slow systemic failure of a body that has been run past its tolerances for too long. It is the most common outcome for people who reach Travis's stage without accessing sustained inpatient care, which, given the systemic barriers documented throughout this story, is the majority. The second outcome is permanent institutionalization, not as a punishment or a judgment, as a medical reality. A subset of chronic P2P users develop psychosis that is sufficiently treatment-resistant and cognitively disabling that independent living becomes unsafe regardless of medication compliance. For these individuals, the psychiatric facility becomes a permanent address. The outcome is alive, sheltered, managed, and entirely dependent on a system that is chronically underfunded and operationally stretched to the point where managed sometimes means more than it delivers. The third outcome, the rarest, the one that requires the specific alignment of intensive early intervention, consistent long-term care, strong social support, and individual neurological factors that no one can predict in advance, is partial recovery, not full. The UCSF data was clear on this, and the MRI of Travis's brain confirmed it from a different angle. The baseline before the drug is not a destination that can be fully reached from where he was standing. But partial recovery is real, documented, and meaningful. People in this category live with managed symptoms, regain some cognitive function, rebuild limited but genuine social connections, and find ways to exist inside a life that is smaller than what they'd had, but is nevertheless theirs. Travis, as of the writing of this story, is in month 2 of inpatient stabilization. His preliminary trajectory places him somewhere between outcomes 2 and 3. Which direction he moves depends on variables that include medication response, abstinence, sustainability, the long-term funding stability of the facility he's in, and whether the social connections that were damaged, Patricia, Emma, the trace of warmth that still flickered when his daughter's name was mentioned, can be rebuilt slowly enough to hold. Patricia visits on Thursdays now. The facility allows it. Travis knows her when she comes in, every time, reliably, without the 30 seconds of evaluation. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't. Travis Cole is not an anomaly. This is the fact that the preceding 9 parts of this story have been building toward, and it's the fact that makes the story something larger than one man's destruction in one county in one state. Travis is a data point, a human, specific, irreducible data point, in a pattern that is replicating itself across rural America with the consistency of something that has been designed, even if no one designed it. No one sat in a room and decided to destroy McDowell County. No one drafted a policy specifically intended to leave rural psychiatric systems so underfunded that a 72-hour hold would be the maximum intervention available for a condition requiring years of care. No one chose to make P2P meth cheaper than a meal, while making treatment more expensive than a car payment. These outcomes emerge from a long sequence of decisions: political, economic, pharmaceutical, legislative, each of which seemed in isolation manageable. Together they produce something that isn't manageable at all. Understanding why requires going back further than Travis's first use in 2024, much further. The P2P meth crisis of 2025 and 2026 has a pharmaceutical origin story that begins in the early 2000s and involves a decision that seemed, at the time, like straightforward drug policy. In 2005, the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act placed strict federal limits on the purchase of pseudoephedrine, the cold medicine ingredient that was the primary precursor for the ephedrine-based meth that had been devastating rural and suburban communities throughout the 1990s. The legislation was well-intentioned, bipartisan, and produced immediate measurable results. Domestic meth production dropped sharply. Law enforcement celebrated. Politicians pointed to it as a model of effective drug policy. The Mexican cartels adapted within 18 months. They had already been manufacturing meth at scale. The pseudoephedrine restrictions simply redirected their chemistry toward P2P, phenyl-2-propanone, a precursor that was more widely available, less regulated internationally, and producible in industrial quantities at a fraction of the cost. The cartels weren't inconvenienced by the 2005 legislation, they were redirected by it. And the direction they were redirected toward produced a drug that was, neurologically, significantly more dangerous than what the legislation had been designed to eliminate. The policy solved the problem it was aimed at and created a worse one. This is not hindsight criticism. It's a documented sequence of cause and effect that addiction researchers were beginning to publish warnings about as early as 2012. Those warnings moved slowly through a policy apparatus that had already declared victory and moved on. The economic dimension of the crisis is inseparable from the pharmaceutical one, because the drug didn't simply appear in rural America. It found purchase there because the conditions were already present to receive it. The deindustrialization of rural America over the 1980s and 1990s, the collapse of manufacturing, mining, and agricultural employment that had anchored working-class communities to something stable, created a population of people who had lost not just income but the identity, structure, and social meaning that work provides. Economists who study addiction have long documented the relationship between unemployment and substance use, but the mechanism is more specific than simple correlation. It's not that people without jobs use drugs. It's that people without purpose, without the daily structure of contribution and competence, without a sense of forward motion, those people are significantly more vulnerable to substances that chemically simulate all three. McDowell County's unemployment rate in 2025 was 14.3%. The national average was 4.1%. The county had lost 60% of its working-age population to outmigration over 3 decades. The people who remained were disproportionately older, poorer, and in worse health than the national average across almost every metric. They were also, by the documented evidence of the preceding decades, significantly more likely to encounter addiction, and significantly less likely to access treatment when they did. Travis's story wasn't a personal tragedy that happened to occur in an economically depressed area. The economically depressed area was part of the mechanism of the tragedy. Remove the jobs, remove the healthcare infrastructure, remove the community institutions, and then introduce a $4 drug that provides chemical relief from the resulting despair, and you haven't set a trap. You've built one. The policy response to the P2P meth crisis of 2025 and 2026 was, by most measurable standards, inadequate, and inadequate in ways that were entirely predictable from the policy response to every preceding drug crisis in the same communities. The federal government allocated $2.1 billion in emergency funding for rural addiction and mental health services in the 2025 budget cycle. This sounds significant. Distributed across the rural counties with documented P2P meth crises in 23 states, it produced an average of approximately $340 per affected individual per year, less than the cost of 1 month's worth of the antipsychotic medication Travis was prescribed and couldn't afford. The funding arrived through a grant mechanism that required counties to have administrative capacity to apply for it, the kind of bureaucratic infrastructure that exists in well-resourced counties and frequently doesn't exist in the ones that need the money most. McDowell County applied. Their application, submitted by a county health department, operating with 3 staff members, covering a population of 17,000, contained a procedural error in the financial disclosure section. The application was returned for correction. The correction deadline passed. The county received no funding in the first cycle. This outcome, not corruption, not malice, just the systemic preference of bureaucratic processes for the organized over the desperate, was repeated in 14 other rural counties across the same funding cycle. Meanwhile, in 2025, the three largest pharmaceutical companies that had been primary drivers of the opioid epidemic through the 1990s and 2000s were completing settlement payments from the litigation that had been building for a decade. The settlements totaled, across all defendants, approximately $26 billion, distributed over 18 years, filtered through state and local government structures, earmarked for addiction treatment and prevention in the communities the opioid epidemic had damaged. McDowell County's share of one settlement payment, received in early 2025, was $340,000. The county's annual budget for all mental health and addiction services was $180,000. The math suggests that the money, in theory, was there. The infrastructure to deploy it effectively, the trained staff, the physical facilities, the treatment capacity, the psychiatric coverage, was not there and could not be built with a single-year infusion of funds into a system that had been systematically dismantled over 15 years. You cannot rebuild a hospital in a year. You cannot train a psychiatrist in a year. You cannot reconstruct community trust in institutions that have failed people repeatedly with a grant cycle and a pamphlet. What 2026 America was actually doing about P2P Meth, beyond the funding mechanisms that weren't reaching their targets, fell into two broad categories, one more visible than effective, one more effective than visible. The more visible category was law enforcement, drug seizures, prosecutions, interdiction efforts at the border and in distribution networks. These efforts were real, ongoing, and expensive. They were also, by the documented evidence of 4 decades of the war on drugs, insufficient as a primary strategy against a substance whose supply chain had the economic incentives and logistical sophistication of a multinational corporation. Seizing a shipment removed product from a market where demand vastly outstripped supply, which temporarily raised prices, which lasted until the next shipment arrived, which it reliably did. The more effective but less visible category was harm reduction, needle exchange programs adapted for stimulant users, fentanyl and meth testing strips, mobile outreach units that brought services to people rather than waiting for people to navigate systems to reach services, and a small number of innovative programs that embedded addiction counselors in emergency rooms, designed specifically to catch people like Travis in the hours after a crisis and connect them to resources before the window closed. The ER-based intervention programs, where they existed, showed the most compelling outcomes in the 2024 and 2025 research literature. Cost-effective, high-contact, timed precisely to the moment when a person in crisis is most receptive to help. In the counties where these programs operated, readmission rates dropped measurably. In the counties where they didn't, which included McDowell, which included most of rural West Virginia, the revolving door kept revolving. The ER program that might have caught Travis in January connected him to sustained support before the 48-hour relapse and changed his trajectory toward outcome 3 instead of outcome 2. That program didn't exist in his county. It existed in a pilot form in 2 counties in southern West Virginia, funded by a private foundation grant, staffed by 2 counselors covering a combined territory of 4 counties on alternating days. The pilot had been running for 8 months. Early results were promising. The grant covered 2 years. After that, its continuation would depend on whether anyone with funding authority was paying attention. There's a specific question that emerges from Travis Cole's story, from the totality of it, from the job and the divorce and the $4 drug and the notebook and the garbage bags and the kitchen floor and the MRI, that the story has been approaching without quite stating directly. At what point does a society become responsible for what it allowed to happen? Not legally responsible. That's a different and narrower question. Morally responsible. Practically responsible. Responsible in the sense that the outcome was foreseeable, the mechanisms that produced it were documentable, and the interventions that might have changed it were known and available and simply not deployed at the scale or speed the situation required. Travis Cole made choices. This is true and should be stated. He chose to use the first time. He chose in the limited sense available to someone whose choice-making machinery was being progressively dismantled to continue. Individual agency is real, even when compromised, and pretending otherwise does its own form of damage. But the choice was made in a county with 14% unemployment and no psychiatrist and a treatment waiting list measured in months. It was made in a context where the drug cost $4 and therapy cost $200. It was made by someone whose social infrastructure, the job, the marriage, the community institutions that might have provided alternative meaning, had been removed by forces with no particular interest in what filled the vacuum. The choice existed. So did everything around it. The communities that P2P Meth is moving through in 2026 are not asking abstract questions about collective responsibility. They're asking concrete ones. Where is the psychiatrist? Why is the waiting list 6 weeks? Why does the medication cost more than a week's groceries? Why did the hospital hold him for 72 hours and release him into nothing? Why did the hotline callback never come? These questions have answers. The answers involve budget decisions made in state capitals and Washington, D.C., by people who represent constituencies that include McDowell County in theory, and in practice represent the aggregate of louder voices and larger donor bases. The answers involve the pharmaceutical industry's decades-long cultivation of prescribing practices that flooded rural communities with opioids, damaged the social fabric, and exited stage left before the consequences fully manifested. The answers involve the specific political economy of rural America, the way that communities with declining populations generate declining political influence, which produces declining resource allocation, which accelerates population decline, which reduces influence further. It's a loop. It runs without anyone specifically driving it. Travis is in a state psychiatric facility. Patricia visits on Thursdays. Emma sent a card last week, a real card, paper, handwritten, mailed to the facility's address that Patricia had given her. The card said she was thinking about him and that she'd been doing well in school. It said she hoped he was feeling better. Travis received the card on a Tuesday afternoon. He read it twice. He held it for a while. Then he put it on the small shelf above his bed, next to a photograph that Patricia had brought on a Thursday. A photo from 6 or 7 years ago, Travis and Emma at a state park somewhere, both of them squinting into summer sun, Travis's arm around her small shoulders, both of them grinning at whoever was behind the camera. He looks at it sometimes, the staff have noted, particularly in the evenings. What he thinks when he looks at it isn't documented. Whether the man in the photograph feels like him, or like someone he used to know, is a question that only Travis can answer, and Travis is not yet at a stage in his treatment where the language for that kind of reflection is fully available to him. But he looks at it. In a county with no psychiatrist, in a state with 28% fewer psychiatric beds than it had 15 years ago, in a country that watched a drug destroy rural communities for a decade before responding at a fraction of the necessary scale, Travis Cole is alive, medicated, and looking at a photograph of himself and his daughter in the summer, both of them squinting into light. That's where the story is right now. Not resolved, not finished, not a lesson learned or a problem solved. Just a man in a bed in a facility that is doing what it can with what it has, while outside the window, in 23 states and hundreds of counties that look a lot like McDowell, the $4 drug is still available within walking distance of people who have nothing except the need for something to cut through the grey. The next Travis is out there right now, probably more than one. The hotline is still putting people on hold. The waiting list is still 6 weeks, and the automatic doors at the Walmart in Bluefield, West Virginia, open and close for people walking in and out all day long, indifferent to everything. Just doors, doing what doors do, breathing for no one,